the circulatory system. And before I get into it, I wanted to go through the path of blood. So hopefully you all have this, and maybe you started on it, maybe not. But your quiz on this will be a quiz, and it's scheduled for Tuesday.
Thursday.
Well, whatever it says on Blackboard, make sure you check the date. It may be Tuesday. The 23rd is Tuesday. Yeah, this is nothing though. You all can learn this in 2 days. Okay. So, all right. So what I'd like to do is kind of give an overview of the circulatory system. So the circulatory system is covered in 3 chapters, 19, 20, and 21. 19 and 20 will be on your next theory exam, along with 18, the endocrine system. 19 is on blood, 20 is on the heart, and 21 will be on blood vessels. But what I'd like for you all to do initially is think about what is the overall function of our circulatory system, if you just think about it. So the circulatory system, first of all, includes blood, the heart, blood vessels. Okay, so that's the circulatory system. And what is the overall function of the circulatory system?
To deliver oxygen and nutrients throughout the body.
Good. So deliver oxygen and nutrients to all the cells of the body. To deliver hormones, right? So we said hormones are secreted into the bloodstream, where they're circulated throughout the body, but only
To the receptive
target organs, target cells are able to respond to them, so they have to be sent into the bloodstream so that it can be circulated throughout the body. Waste has to be eliminated. So we'll get into specifics of the functions of blood, for example, and the function of the heart, which is pretty simple. Without the heart, we wouldn't be able to what? Pump blood. So blood would just sit there, right? So the function of the heart is to pump blood throughout the body. And so what I wanted you all to do first is have an understanding of the fact that the circulatory system is a closed system. What does that mean? So the circulatory system is a closed system.
Nothing can get in or out.
Right, so pretty much the blood stays in the circulatory system, right? There's no exit for blood unless the vessel is cut open or something like that. So if that's the case, I guess you could think of a hula hoop. So a hula hoop is closed, so if you fill it with water, the water just stays inside. Okay, if you add a pump to that, the water may move, but it's going to pump in one direction if you wanted to do that. And that's what the heart does. The heart is responsible for pumping blood in one direction. So if you think of the circulatory system as closed, and that whatever is in the circulatory system is moving and in one direction, then if blood starts in one spot, you should be able to trace the path of that blood, that one drop of blood, to the same spot. Okay? So I like to start at the right atrium, but like I said, once you learn this, you should be able to start at any point. So on your test, your quiz, and on your theory exam, you're going to have to know this as well. So on your quiz, I may start at the pulmonary trunk. So what? If you know the path, you know the next place that blood goes after it leaves the pulmonary trunk. Okay? So learn it that way. And the reason I put this picture up is now you all know the parts of the heart. And believe me, it's easier to learn this if you're actually visualizing the blood moving through those parts instead of just memorizing words in order. Plus, memorizing words in order just is not going to help you learn anything, right? You all are really trying to learn how blood moves And most of you going into nursing, I do hear that this is one of the first things they ask you about is the path of blood. So they expect for you to know it when you get there. Okay, so let's start at the right atrium. So my starting point is the right atrium. So what I would suggest you do is as you're going through this path, as much as possible, look at a picture of the right atrium. And I put this picture up there because it actually labels the path to some degree, so that you'll see that some parts are not labeled, but you should be able to follow it either way. So notice the heart has 4 chambers, right? So those 4 chambers there are 2 atria, the left atrium and the right atrium, and 2 ventricles, left and right ventricles. So when blood is in the right atrium and the atria contract, which means squeeze, blood is squeezed. Whenever blood is squeezed from the atria, it should make sense that the blood is going to fall down into the ventricles. Okay, so that's kind of how we start here. So when the right atria contracts, blood flows through first the what? The tricuspid valve, and then it flows into the right ventricle. Okay, so there's no memorization there. You just actually see it. Right atrium, through the tricuspid valve, right ventricle. Okay, so now, if you look at the heart, what happens if you squeeze the right ventricle? First of all, make sense of it. And looking at the picture, where possibly could blood go if you squeeze the ventricle? So you're squeezing the bottom of the heart, so blood is going to shoot up. Okay? So what are the 2 options that are there?
Through the aortic valve or through the pulmonary.
Right, so it could go right back up to the right atrium, right? Or it could go where it's supposed to go, which is through the pulmonary valve. Okay? So why is it not going back up to the atrium? Remember, for any of this to work, blood has to go in one direction. We'll see why in a moment. So why do you think it cannot go up to the right atrium from the right ventricle?
Just the right atrium squeeze.
Well, actually, they don't. That's a good point. But the atrium ventricles don't squeeze at the same time.
So when the right squeeze is the left open or the pulmonary valve open?
No, we're just on one side. So just focus on the one side. So when the right ventricle squeezes, again, blood is going to go wherever it can, and it's up. And right, so that's what the valves are for. I was going to mention that the purpose of the valves of the heart is to prevent blood from going backwards. Okay, and you probably can't see it too well there, but the tricuspid valve and all the valves are kind of funnel shaped, and so when blood is above, blood can push through. And when blood tries to come back up, the blood actually pushes the valves closed. So the tricuspid valve closes whenever the right ventricle is squeezed. So blood cannot go back up to the right atrium. Instead, it goes the only place it can go, and that's going to be up through the what? Pulmonary valve. Okay, so from the pulmonary valve, blood goes into the pulmonary trunk. So if you just follow the picture, the pulmonary trunk leads into the what? Pulmonary arteries. Okay?
How would it get to the right pulmonary artery?
Because the right, because this is an opening. So just imagine a pulmonary artery. Just imagine a T-shaped kind of tube. So whatever flows through that middle part is going to flow in both directions.
So it's like a water sit on the seat.
Well, yeah, right, but it's not interfering with it in any way. You just don't see the other side of the T on the picture. Okay, but it's an opening on both sides. Okay? Now, something else I wanted you all to notice here is the word pulmonary. So you see that how many times up here?
4.
Pulmonary valve, pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries, pulmonary veins. Okay, so that word pulmonary should mean something to you. Lungs. Okay, so when you see pulmonary, you should be thinking lungs. Okay, so the blood, and what about the color blue? What does the color mean? So you saw the blood, some vessels are blue, some are red in your book. Okay, so whenever you see blue, that means the blood in that area is CO2 rich. So blood is either CO2 rich or oxygen rich. Okay, so the blood on the theory exam question, blood on the right side of the heart is what? CO2 rich. Okay, so the CO2 rich blood has to be sent to the lungs. What do you all know about the lungs?
Breathe out CO2 and breathe in oxygen.
There you go. So what happens at the lungs when we exhale, CO2 is being released from the body. When we inhale, oxygen is coming in. Okay? So the CO2 is coming from the blood. So look at it this way. The right side of the heart has one job, and one job only. That is to send the blood that's in the right side of the heart to the lungs and back. That's it. So the right side of the heart has the job of sending CO2-rich blood to the lungs and returning oxygen-rich blood back to the heart. Okay? So that's why from the right atrium all the way through the pulmonary veins, this is called the pulmonary circuit. The pulmonary circuit is including the right side of the heart and the whole path really back to the heart. So it's called the pulmonary circuit again because the only job that circuit has is to send blood to the lungs and back to the heart. Okay? So now, blood is CO2 rich at the right atrium, through the tricuspid valve and right ventricle, pulmonary valve, pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries. So the blood in the pulmonary arteries is still CO2 rich. Now what happens is that blood flows through the lungs.
It exchanges.
Okay, so that's where the lungs is where you have gas exchange. So one of the gas exchanges occurs at the lungs. So as blood enters the lungs, that blood is what? Still CO2 rich. But as the blood flows through the lungs, CO2 is leaving the blood and oxygen is coming into the blood. Okay, so that when the blood leaves the lungs, that blood is going to be what? Oxygen rich. Okay, y'all get that? So that oxygen rich blood now is being sent back to what? Back to the heart, right? So the whole point is to pick up the oxygen and return that blood back to the heart. But it has to get there through the pulmonary veins. So from the lungs to pulmonary veins, and now we're back at the what? Back at the heart. Okay? Right. So again, remember, right side of heart, job is to send blood to the lungs and back to the heart. For what purpose? To dump off CO2 and pick up oxygen. Okay? Now, it's called the pulmonary circuit. Pulmonary circuit. Delivers blood to the lungs to drop off CO2 and pick up oxygen and return that oxygenated blood back to the heart. One other thing. Notice the word artery and vein. What do those words mean to you? So what would be the definition of an artery? This is a must know. You all must know.
Blood from the heart.
So an artery Good. Excuse me. Is a blood vessel that carries blood
From the heart to the lungs.
away from the heart. Okay, so by definition, if you call a blood vessel an artery, that blood vessel is carrying blood away from the heart. And veins are blood vessels that carry blood to the heart. Okay, so in the test you all just had, you learned that the arteries were what color? The red, and the veins were blue. But those were systemic. So with systemic arteries and veins, the colors are going to be like that. But what do we just see about the pulmonary veins and pulmonary arteries? The pulmonary artery is what? It's blue. So here's a blue artery. So if you learn that all arteries are oxygen rich, that's not right. So learn the strict definition of an artery. Blood vessels carry blood away from the heart, and veins carry blood back to the heart. Okay, so in the pulmonary circuit, that's where you see it's reversed, because the pulmonary circuit is sending blood away from the heart, but that blood is what? CO2 rich, and it's returning oxygenated blood back to the heart through veins, which are now oxygen rich. Okay, so make sure you all remember that. All right, so now the right side of the heart has done its job. Now what? So the whole point was to get oxygen-rich blood back to the left side of the heart. And now that blood is in the left atrium. Now what? So what do you think the left side of the heart is supposed to do now? The job of the left side of the heart.
Because you did the rest of the body.
Mm-hmm. So the right side of the heart only had the job of sending blood to the what?
Lungs.
The lungs and back. The left side of the heart has to send that oxygenated blood.
Back to the right side of the heart.
So where's oxygen? So the whole point of picking up oxygen was what? Well, it's at the heart now. Why did the heart want oxygenated blood? It was CO2 rich, but what's the point of having oxygen rich blood?
Nutrients.
For the body. The rest of the body.
For the rest of the body. Okay, so the left side of the heart has the job of sending that oxygen to my fingers, to my brain, to my toes, everything in between. Okay, so the right side of the heart is just sending blood to the lungs and back. The left side of the heart is sending blood to every other tissue of my body.
Does that mean it's
And back.
stronger? Or,
Good question. Okay, so we're going to look at the path there. So the path, and I'm going to remind me to mention that because I forgot to yesterday. So the blood in the left atrium. Okay, so we went from the lungs to the pulmonary veins. Now we're at the left atrium. And looking at the picture, you can see blood then goes where? Through the bicuspid valve and then to the left ventricle. So it falls in the left ventricle. So what do you think? Yeah, so blood in the two atria falls down to the ventricles. Okay? Now, so where does blood go when it leaves the left ventricle? Back up. But is it back up to the left atrium?
No, it doesn't make sense.
Why not? What's keeping it from going back to the left atrium? Because the valve closes. So when the left ventricle squeezes, blood pushes the valves closed. So there's only one other place for that blood to go. That's through and it's kind of hard to see it here, but that's the aortic valve.
Now, is that behind the pulmonary valve?
It actually through the intraventricular.
What do you mean, how? So this picture, you really can't see the valve that well, but when you squeeze the blood in the left ventricle, it has to go somewhere. And there's really only two openings, and one of those openings is closed by the bicuspid valve. So the only other opening, which you can't really see in the picture, if you look in your book, you may have a better picture. And so the blood goes through the only other opening, which is going to be the aortic valve.
What I'm saying is, so blood can go through a valve.
Yeah, but valves allow one-way flow of blood. And so if you look how the pulmonary valve is shaped. So the way it's shaped, it's obvious that blood can only go up, right? If blood tries to come down, it's kind of cupped, so it's going to be pulled closed, so it can't get back through. And if you've heard of a heart murmur, what's happening is the valves are not closed all the way, so some blood can get back through. A little bit of blood can get back through if the valves don't close all the way.
And that's what's causing the extra beat.
Yeah.
So
So it's not an extra sound. It's like more of a shh.
Oh.
Right, it's not an extra beat. Okay, so from the left ventricle through the aortic valve.
Now, is it behind the pulmonary trunk?
Yes.
Okay.
So you can see that it's behind not quite up that high. It's kind of at the same level as the pulmonary valve, but it's going behind it in this picture, yes. Because you can see the aorta. Look where the aorta is. So this red line is showing you the path, but that's behind the pulmonary trunk. Okay. Y'all see it? Okay, so now what? So blood has been pumped out of the left ventricle. Now that blood in the left ventricle has to make it somehow to your fingertips, your brain, your feet, and every tissue in between. And so how does it get there? Through those blood vessels, right? So the arteries. So you have the aorta, then you have the arteries. One other thing Ms. Franklin just mentioned. So look at the walls of the ventricle. Compare the left ventricle to the right ventricle wall. Notice any difference? So no matter what picture you look at, you're going to see that the wall of the left ventricle is thicker than the wall of the right ventricle. Any idea why? And that's all what? Muscle. Right. Exactly. So the left side of the heart has to pump blood further than the right side. The right side of the heart, if you think of where it has to pump blood, the right side of the heart is just pumping blood to the lungs and back. That's nowhere. The left side of the heart is pumping blood, as I said, to the rest of the body. So it has to be stronger. And so the left side of the heart has to be strong enough to pump blood not only to the tissues, but then back to the heart. Okay, so that's a pretty big distance. But me pumping blood from my heart to my feet and then back up to my heart. A big distance, so that's going to take more force. All right, so how do we get blood to my big toe? So blood enters the aorta, and then it starts to enter smaller blood vessels called arteries, and then those arteries send blood on into smaller vessels called arterioles, and I'll get to that in a second. So looking at the aorta, what are these three branches on the top of the aorta? What's the name of them? So which is the first one to get blood from the aorta?
Looks like the brachial.
Good. So the brachiocephalic trunk. Very good. There's a branch off of the aorta. What's the second one? Huh? Good. Left common carotid, and then the left subclavian. That was decent. I've heard it pronounced all kinds of ways. And then, so the rest of it, so you have that. And so the brachiocephalic trunk branches into, remember at the top of the brachiocephalic trunk, you have two branches.
The right
common carotid.
And the right subclavian.
Right subclavian, very good. So the right subclavian is responsible for passing blood to the right upper limb. The right common carotid sending blood to the neck, the head, the face, the brain.
Why I thought the brachiocephalic gave it to the brain?
It does, because the blood from the brachiocephalic sends blood to the carotid. It's branching. Yeah. Yeah. Right.
To the right part.
Exactly.
Okay.
Okay. Now, how does blood get to my feet?
The inferior vena.
That's the other side. So what does the aorta do? What's the rest of the aorta? The descending aorta sends blood to the rest of the body. Okay.
Is that little part?
No, remember the descending aorta has a thoracic
And
aorta
abdominal.
and abdominal, and those have branches off of it.
Oh.
Okay. So blood is sent through those arteries. Okay, so the aorta is just a large artery. That's all it means. The largest artery we have is the aorta, and it branches into smaller arteries. So these are just medium-sized arteries, and then very tiny arterioles. So all of these are arteries. One is very large, medium, very tiny. And now, yeah.
So like the right subclavicle, that would be like arterial.
Huh?
Like the right subclavicle, is that like
Right subclavian?
Subclavian.
No, all of those are arteries. The arterioles are very close to the actual tissue that it's going to supply. So you don't really see the arterioles because they're so tiny. And then arterioles lead into capillaries. Now capillaries are important because they are the only blood vessel that allows whatever's in the blood to actually go out. Hormones, so we know hormones circulate, but how do they get out to the tissues? There's only one place. All of our tissues have capillaries. So as blood flows through tissue capillaries, that's where the nutrients come out. Oxygen, glucose, and whatever other nutrients have to pass from the blood into the tissues. That happens at the tissue capillaries. Tissue capillaries are so tiny. Think about, can you see a red blood cell with your naked eye? No. So even if you had 100 of them stacked here, you wouldn't see it. So the capillaries, like vessels, but the capillaries are so tiny that only one red blood cell can go through at a time. So not even two blood cells can get through the capillaries, only one at a time. So that tells you how small capillaries are. And that's why the vessels close to the capillaries must be tiny too. Okay, so we have arterioles. I mean, if you have the big aorta and the capillary, what blood is going to go from this big vessel through there? So they have to match up. So as blood gets further away from the heart, the vessels get smaller and smaller, so they meet up with the tiny capillaries. So think of the arterioles and venules as very tiny because they have to be to meet up with the capillaries. And try to find a picture of the capillaries so you can see what they look like. All right, so as blood enters the capillaries, the blood is going to be what?
Cleared of all oxygen.
Well, it goes in oxygen rich. Okay? So there's been no place where oxygen could go until capillaries. So remember, oxygen can't come in or out unless it's at a capillary. CO2 can't come in or out of blood unless it's at a capillary. So even though I have lungs up here, really it's the lung capillaries where the gas exchange occurs. Okay, so as blood goes through the capillary of my finger, so every tissue has capillaries. So my fingertip has capillaries, and as blood goes through, Oxygen is leaving the capillaries and going into my tissue, the body tissues, my finger tissues, and then into the cells of my finger. And CO2 is going to leave that tissue, and the CO2 is going to come into the blood vessel at the capillaries. So when blood leaves the capillaries, it's going to be what? CO2 rich. Notice the color change. Okay? And then that CO2 rich blood, this has to be sent back to the lungs for us to exhale. But to get back to the lungs, it has to first get back to the right side of the heart. Right? So remember, the right side of the heart sends blood to the lungs and back. So how do we get back from the capillaries to the heart? Through the venules, tiny veins. And why are these called veins?
So carrying it to the heart.
Because they're carrying blood back to the heart. Okay? Venules, veins which are medium sized, vena cava, which is a large vein. So the largest veins of the body are the superior and inferior vena cava, and they both dump blood back into the what? Back into the right atrium. And then we start over. Well, blood from the brain comes back down through the superior. Blood from my feet comes up through the inferior vena cava. So once the tissues get the oxygen, so the blood is just transporting oxygen to the tissues, but those tissues are dumping off CO2. Where in the world is the CO2 coming from? So first of all, the oxygen going to the tissues is for what purpose? Why do the cells of my finger need oxygen?
For energy,
To make. No, that is the oxygen. So why is the blood carrying oxygen and glucose to the cells of my finger? So my cells right here can make ATP. But if you all remember the equation for cell respiration, you have glucose plus oxygen makes ATP. Remember what else? Water and H2O. H2O and CO2. So whenever we make ATP, we also make CO2. Okay? And that aerobic cell respiration, our cells, if we can make ATP, we automatically going to make CO2. But CO2 is a waste, so we have to get rid of it. Okay? That's why it's called an exchange. The tissues are giving giving CO2 back to the blood while picking up oxygen from the blood. Okay, so the CO2, and our body has to get rid of CO2 or we die. So the CO2 that the cells make is waste. And what it does is causes the blood to become too acidic. So we have to get rid of it. Okay, so that CO2 from the tissues is sent back to the heart, where it then is sent to the what? The lungs. When we exhale, we get rid of it. Okay? If you hold your breath a long time, that's what causes you to start breathing again. If you hold your breath, that CO2 is not getting out. So that's going to cause hyperventilation. We'll get to that. It's a little bit deeper than you all need to know right now. Okay? So that's the path of blood. Hope that made it a little bit easier. So